Father, many of us heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den as children, and some of us have taught this story in children's Sunday school or to our own children. Your word is living and active, alive and powerful, able to penetrate our heart with fresh meaning, application each day. In Proverbs 25, you tell us it is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out. As we study chapter 6 together, help us to search and to recognize the deep truths that you planted in these verses and why the lion's den meant so much to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, last week, the Persian army arrived in Babylon and they killed Belshazzar and took over the Babylonian Empire. And they installed Darius the Mede as the new ruler there in the city of Babylon. So this week we're starting Daniel chapter 6, and it's really the lesson of the lion's den. It's one of the most familiar that we find in the Old Testament. It's similar to Daniel chapter 5 in the way that it focuses on just one night in the life of Daniel. So that will begin once you get to verse 10. It's all focused on the one night that he was in the lion's den. And the lion's den was given the same amount of scripture as Daniel chapter 7. So you'll see that chapter 6 has 28 verses, chapter 7 also has 28 verses. And what's interesting there is that chapter 7 is kind of a panoramic view of all of world history. This is where Daniel has the dream of the four kingdoms, the four beasts. And so you have 28 verses covering all of world history, and then from God's perspective, he actually used the same amount of ink to cover one night in the life of Daniel when he was in the lion's den. So from God's perspective then, this lion's den is a very significant event, not only in Daniel's life, but it's significant for us as well. And that's the purpose of our study as we go through chapter 6, is to understand why the lion's den meant so much to God. So we'll dive in now. We're going to Daniel chapter 6, and I'll read verse 1 through 3, where King Darius appoints Daniel. So it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, and each of these satraps would be like a governor, like a prince ruling over a territory. You think about the Prince of Wales having responsibility for a certain region. So each of these 120 satraps were throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set Daniel over the whole kingdom. So who was this King Darius? What do we know from history about him? There are critics of the Bible that claim Darius was fictional. They don't believe that he ever even lived, and they just think the whole story of Daniel was a fairy tale. They claim that the book of Daniel was written around 150 BC rather than 530 BC, which is the traditional conservative date for the book. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the series, but the main reason they believe that is Daniel chapter 11. So they look at it and say, Daniel chapter 11 could not possibly have been written by a human being 400 years ahead of time. And that's why they come to that conclusion. Well, Cyrus captures Babylon. He picks Darius to be the king, and historians tell us that this Darius became sick and died within about 2 years of becoming king. And then Cyrus became king following Darius, and Cyrus ruled until 530 BC. The Bible tells us at the end of chapter 5 that Darius was 62 years old when he took over and became ruler. That was on the night at the end of chapter 5 when King Belshazzar was killed by the Persian soldiers. And it says that Darius was made ruler, so he was appointed. It was just something that he was put in place. He was named for that role. And apparently he ruled for at least 1 year, because Daniel chapter 9, once we get there, has some more to say about him. Darius was the son of a man named Ahasuerus. That's a Hebrew name. And then in some places you'll also see it translated as Xerxes. Xerxes is the Greek or Persian translation of that same name. And you'll find in the book of Esther, the very first verse in Esther is talking about a later king who had that same name. So some of the translations had Xerxes and some have Ahasuerus for that same king. King James has Ahasuerus, and then ESV also has that, but then NIV has the Xerxes translation. Darius organized this new government. He sets up the 120 satraps, the princes, under 3 presidents. And again, some of the critics would say, oh, that's too many people. It's ridiculous to think that a king would have so many rulers under him. And so they think that's part of the fairy tale that Daniel's exaggerating. But again, you look down at the beginning of Esther, that very first verse again tells us there were 127 provinces in the Persian Empire. And that was about 60 years later after this event, when the book of Esther comes along. And it extended all the way from India to eastern part of Africa. So it's a very large empire. It's the land that the Medes and the Persians had already conquered. Now they've taken the Babylonian Empire in addition to all of that. So that they did need that many local rulers. Septuagint is the first time that the Old Testament was translated, so they converted it from Hebrew into Greek. They started working that in 280 BC at the library in Alexandria down in Egypt, a great library. They worked on it for about 100 years before they completed that translation into Greek. And in Septuagint, it talks about in Daniel chapter 6 that Cyrus took control at some time after Darius died. And that was around 537 BC. So people look at that and say, well, that must mean that Darius came in and set up an empire under the Medes, and then later after he died, Cyrus comes and sets up a Persian empire on top of that, a different empire. But what we know from history and archaeology, it's very clear outside the Bible that the Medes and the Persians were together all along. It was always a Medo-Persian empire, united from the very beginning. So this Darius and Cyrus were teammates. They were not rivals. They were not competing against each other for that land. They were together. And so I give you what is the traditional conservative view, and you can read a lot more about this, books from J. Vernon McGee, Clarence Larkin, and others that go over all this history in detail. But they're going all the way back to the ancient historians that they had Xenophon back in 400 BC, not long after this happened. And then Josephus gives us the same information, but they still believe that 500 years later, around 70 AD, not long after the first Easter, a few decades. And then even Jerome, when you get 400 AD, it's all consistent over about 8 centuries that they all understood it the same way. And what happened was that this Persian army general, Cyrus, he's the one that leads the army in that night when they lowered the river and they go in under the walls and they capture the city. And so he is the conqueror. He now is in control of Babylon and the empire. And he is the one who appointed or who set Darius as the king in the city of Babylon, just in that territory. So Cyrus is ruling over the whole empire, everything they've captured. But Darius is the local administrator or king in the city of Babylon. And the reason that the critics have not been able to find the name Darius is that his official name, his title as the king of Media, was Cyaxares II, and he's known as the last king of Media. We know that he ruled for 2 years, and the relationship here is that Darius is the uncle of Cyrus. And so Cyrus is the one who followed him as king, so you have the uncle initially for a year or two, and then the nephew takes over as king. And the family relationship there's a lady named Queen Mundane that's the mother of Cyrus, and she's Darius's sister. So there you have the royal family of Persia at that time. So soon after these events in chapter 5, when you have the feast and Belshazzar is killed, Darius begins to set up his new governor. So you have the change of administrations where he is eliminating all of his political enemies and putting in people that he can trust. And that's true down through history. Every culture, every nation that you go to, when you have a change of power, you'll have this sort of cleaning out of the old guard and then replacing with new people that are loyal. And so that's why he's appointing these 120 satraps instead of using the people that were there under Babylon. But it's interesting that, Daniel was appointed the third highest ruler in Babylon right before this happened. And you expect Darius to come in and kill him just like Belshazzar was killed, because Daniel's standing there. He's got the purple robe. He's got the gold chain around his neck. He might as well have a bullseye painted on his forehead. He's the ruler. He's the head of the old empire. And the soldiers are thinking, we need to kill this guy. And Darius says, no, let's save him for the new kingdom. Daniel is the only one that transitions and becomes a leader in the new empire. And you notice that Belshazzar was dead that night. He was the second highest ruler. His father, Nabonidus, was the first ruler, the primary king, and he had been captured, so he had been out fighting the Medes and the Persians in the battle. And now he is taken out in the picture. So the top ruler is gone, the second ruler is gone. Daniel now becomes the king of the Babylonian Empire for a few minutes. And then King Darius comes in and is officially put in place. Daniel receives this place of high honor in the new kingdom. So he's one of these three top leaders, a president, a chief financial officer, along with two others under Darius. And that position is actually even higher than being the third highest ruler in Babylon. He is now in this three-way tie for second place for the second ruler, right under King Darius. And he's on the verge of being promoted. So Darius says that because of Daniel's distinguished service, the king now intends to promote Daniel. And apparently Daniel is in line to become prime minister, which is the same situation you see with Joseph in Egypt. Back at the end of Genesis, he becomes second only to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. And now we're on page 40 of the back of the handout, and these promotions that Daniel has received down through the years, all through his service, it proves to us that believers don't have to compromise in order to be successful. I gave you the verse there from Matthew 6 about seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and that all these things will be added unto you. You don't have to worry if you're doing what God has called you to do. So we need to be seeking God first instead of trying to seek power or fame or fortune or any other thing that the world goes after. And Jesus prayed, this was in John 17 in his prayer, verse 15 through 19, that we would be in the world, but not of the world, that we would not become corrupted, not get down in the mud and do the things the unbelievers do, that we walk set apart, sanctified in the world, and then that he will take care of us. So you think back to the beginning, this is in Daniel chapter 2, when Daniel was a teenager. At that time, his position was comparable to Supreme Court justice as a teenager. And then he continues to get promoted, and now he's in line to become prime minister of the Persian Empire. And he's been serving for 66 years through these changing administrations. So at the time that I wrote this, I thought about, well, it's 1999. He's been serving 66 years. What would that look like under our U.S. presidents that we had historically at that time? So it's just like if Daniel had started serving in the government in 1933. He started out at the beginning of Franklin Roosevelt's first term, and he served with FDR through all of those terms. Then he served under Harry Truman. Then he served under Dwight D. Eisenhower. Then he served under John F. Kennedy. He served under Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan for 2 terms and George H.W. Bush, 41. And then he served under Clinton. That's how long Daniel has been in a key leadership role in the government of 2 empires. As the kings come and go, one after another, Daniel is still there. He's the constant. And his career was blessed, and it's because he consistently obeyed God. He went where God wanted him to go, did what God called him to do. So he has this life above reproach. He's growing in holiness. He's growing in godliness, so that he can grow in usefulness to God. that he can be an instrument in the Redeemer's hand in serving. And his career is no accident. God wanted him in this position of leadership at this crucial time where you have the transition, the change of the empires. It's a 70-year captivity that God has sent the Jews into Babylon, and now it's time for them to go back home. And Daniel has been there from the beginning, and now he will be there as they leave and as they go back. And so God has used Daniel to influence Cyrus and to really bring about this decree that sends the Jews home. Cyrus is mentioned 23 times in the Bible, and I'll give you some examples there from Ezra chapter 1, Ezra chapter 6, where he's prominent. But Cyrus wrote the decree, so Cyrus says the exiles can go back now, they can rebuild Jerusalem, they can rebuild their temple. He sends them back with what they need. And this decree is very favorable to the Jews, so he doesn't just come in and say, you can go now. He's sending them with blessings. And it kind of reminded me of back in the Exodus when Pharaoh said, no, I'm not going to let you go. I'm not going to set the people free. They've been slaves for 400 years in Egypt. And then when they go, they've got all this treasure, all this gold and everything that the Egyptians are sending them away, loaded down with treasure. It's a similar sort of thing that happens here. So being that favorable to people that had been slaves indicates that Daniel had some influence in writing and designing that decree. So then our last section today, we'll read Daniel chapter 6, verse 4 and 5, where we have the plot to discredit Daniel. The high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful. No error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Daniel's integrity, the experience that he had as a local administrator there in Babylon for decades, is going to be a great benefit to Darius, and Darius understands that. But the younger colleagues, these are the satraps and the other high officials, they scrutinized Daniel's work. Probably they scrutinized his personal life. Possibly they even hired private detectives to follow Daniel around. They're looking for something. They're trying to trip him up and find some offense they can use against him. What kind of motive would cause that kind of friction? What would cause these people, the other officials, to be so determined that they're going to eliminate Daniel? They want to take him out. Well, human sin nature, and this is whenever God's Spirit is not in control of a person, when they see excellence, any kind of excellence, they're going to react to that with jealousy. That's the human sin nature response, is that they're jealous of what someone else has. And so Daniel did not want the things that his neighbors had. What Daniel wanted is what God wanted for him. You think about a verse like Philippians 4:8, where we think about whatever is trustworthy, whatever is praiseworthy, excellent. We need to admire these things. We need to understand that this is a gift from God that he's given to someone, one of our neighbors. And think about it, how beautiful this gift from God is, not to covet that thing, not to desire that thing. And then Paul gets into it more in 1 Corinthians 12 about believers having different spiritual gifts. But we're not to lust after what our neighbor has. We're to be content with what God has given each of us, a unique gift. Psalm 37, verse 4, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. So that the conspirators, they may have also felt that this was unfair because Daniel is old, he's a Jew, he's one of the former captives. From their perspective, he's got some strikes against him. He'd been part of that enemy administration, and all the others had been killed off. Why was Daniel allowed to stay and become their prime minister? And so people who are greedy, people who are incompetent, always hate trustworthy people. And it's because the trustworthy people expose their greed and incompetence. And of course, we see that all the time. We see that down through history. We see it today in our culture. Anyone who is gifted, let's say someone has good grades in school, they're academically gifted, or someone has musical talent, or someone has athletic ability, anyone that has a special gift that stands out, anyone blessed with a talent is always going to pay a price for that, and it involves persecution where the people around them are jealous, that they react that way to seeing excellence. And it's just kind of a backhanded compliment here, because the people who knew Daniel best, the people who spent a lot of time with him, people who followed him around, tried to find something about him, they realized, they were absolutely convinced, he is excellent, he is pure, he is a good person. And so it's just they're having a negative response to it, but there's no doubt they recognize the excellent spirit that God has put into it and caused Daniel to be godly. So this pure heart, this godly character that Daniel has, his spotless record, it really sticks out. And I give you the illustration of the flower sticking up out of the pigsty. It's obvious. The contrast is so sharp between Daniel and the others. You think about how they do this on Sesame Street. One of these rulers is not like the others. One of these leaders is not the same. Daniel is visibly different from all the others. The king recognized it, and so did these enemies. And at the Last Supper, Jesus calls us to walk in the same way and says, walk in the world for me. We are his ambassadors. He has called us to represent him, and he makes his appeal to the lost through us. So we are different. We are set apart. We are sanctified. He calls us to live differently. And these other leaders, they're all ambitious. They're eager to advance their own careers. So they're looking for some way to trip up Daniel, get him out of the way so that they can be advanced themselves. And the only thing they could find wrong in Daniel's life is that he served God. And that's a good problem to have. If you come to the end, and that's what people remember about you, that's your epitaph, is that he served God or she served God. So how many of us today could withstand what he went through, all the magnifying glasses of all these inspectors trying to find some flaw, and yet they never could? And remember, the source of life for the city, for the town of Babylon there, was the river. And so in order to capture Babylon, to conquer it, Cyrus had to cut off the river. He had to cut off their source of life. For Daniel, the only hope to defeat Daniel is to attack his source of life, and that is his devotion to God. Jesus tells us in John 15, verse 5, that he is the vine, we are the branches. So all of our nourishment, everything that we need spiritually, emotionally, physically, comes through him. And in order to remove that, the enemies realized they had to cut the vine. They had to somehow break that relationship that Daniel had with God. And the leaders had to set up some sort of conflict, so it had to be the king's law versus God's law, that you had to choose. You come to a fork in the road, who are you going to serve? And it's the same thing Peter sees in Acts. You get to verses in Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 5, where they realize we have to serve God rather than men if there's a conflict when those two things oppose each other. So Daniel's devotion to God is going to force him to deny King Darius's law and to break that new law, because one thing the conspirators knew for sure is that Daniel is always going to follow God and obey God's command. That's what they're counting on, and that they knew that would never fail. So this plot that they're devising here, it foreshadows what we'll see during the tribulation. As you get into the false prophet, the beast, the mark of the beast that's imposed during those 7 years. And at that time, if you refuse to take the mark of the beast, that's going to set apart the Christians, and make them appear to be subversive. And so the mark is going to create the conflict between the one world government and God's law, Christianity. And then the refusal to comply with that law is what's used to justify the execution of the believers during the end times. And it's the same with Daniel. So next week, we'll look at the other leaders, how they designed this trap to capture Daniel. They tricked the king into signing a law that you have to pray only to the king. You can't pray to the true God or anyone else. And Daniel remains faithful. He's going to continue this habit of prayer. This law does not change him in any way. He refused to compromise even when he was facing the death penalty. So I hope you'll be able to harness that.